Confessions of a Failed Southern Lady by Florence King, Chapter 3. The experts of the 30s swore by the bottle, but Granny preached femininity, so Mama nursed me for 8 months. The immunities I gained were cancelled out by the perils of our particular Madonna and Child scenario. My little blankets were full of scorched holes, and I developed severe colic from her impassioned shouts of "Throw him out at third!" as she listened to the radio. Once I was weaned, I passed exclusively into Granny's hands. It was the era of the scientific nursery. Women's magazines insisted on strict schedules, fanatic measurements like 2/3 of an ounce, and the absolute need to protect baby from germs. But Granny, a Southern primitive and a hardy Saxon underneath her genteel veneer, dismissed it all with, "A few germs never hurt anybody." If I dropped my pacifier on the floor, she picked it up, wiped it off on her apron, and stuck it back in my mouth. She doctored me herself. Intoning, "Whiskey or salt will cure anything," she spoon-fed me hot toddies and taught me to gargle before I could talk. I received no vitamins, no cod liver oil, and was never touched by a pediatrician. She refused to recognize what the magazines called tender baby stomachs. So I acquired all sorts of acquired tastes by the age of 3. Raw oysters, pickled pig's feet, and olives were my staples, and coffee was my favorite beverage. "It won't hurt her," said Granny, and Mama, who drank 20 cups a day, poured us both a refill. Whether it was a chemical imbalance or simply a manifestation of the nonconformity that swirled around me, I developed a dislike of sweets that grew into an aversion, and thence into what seemed to be an allergy. "My nose is beating," I whimpered one day, after eating out of politeness a piece of candy a neighbor gave me. The bridge of my nose was throbbing like an arterial pressure point. The idea of taking me to a doctor never crossed Granny's mind. She was not one to go all medical as long as genealogy was at hand. "The Uptons have never had anything like that, neither have the Ruddings. Mr. King, does beating nose bridge run in your family?" "No, but we lived for a time at Notting Hill Gate." After I outgrew my crib, I slept with Granny on the convertible sofa. On any given night, our bed contained a hot water bag or an ice bag, depending upon her affliction of the moment, tubes of Bengay and Musterol with or without caps, loose Lydia Pinkham pills that felt like buckshot, old mustard plasters that fell off her back and stuck to the sheets, a box of Kleenex, crochet needles, and 1 or more copies of the Daughter's Magazine. Without her shapely, stout corsets, she billowed out like a tube of Pillsbury biscuit dough when you press on the dotted line. Each time she turned over, I identified with the characters on comic book covers who were always racing away from collapsing skyscrapers or cresting tidal waves. Her sound effects were out of the Mesozoic age, an accusation she denied with her usual sublime self-assurance. "I do not snore. Snoring is unladylike." My training for ladyhood began with the duets we sang in bed. "They don't write songs the way they used to," she said darkly, citing Body and Soul as an example of degeneracy. To keep me from going bad when I grew up, she taught me the suitable hits from her youth. Propped up on our pillows, she crocheting and I crayoning a coloring book, we gave forth with earnest renditions of "She's More to be Pitied Than Censured," "She May Have Seen Better Days," and "The Picture That's Turned Toward the Wall." "Oh, shit," said Mama from the bedroom. Mama took care of my outings. Her favorite arena was Meridian Hill Park on 16th Street, which contained an equestrian statue of Joan of Arc that she liked. Gripping the handle of my stroller, she would break into a dead heat and race down the terrace, yelling, "Charge!" Her addiction required a lot of time out. but she always observed Granny's ironclad rule, the only one to my knowledge that she ever paid attention to. "I'm going to have a cigarette while we're sitting on the bench. It's all right to smoke on the street if you're sitting down, as long as you don't do it while you're walking." We sat down a lot on our walks. Had we lived anywhere else, she would have fallen into a nicotine fit. But Washington, like the Paris that inspired it, has a lot of parks. We had no sooner left one than Mamma was hurrying furtively toward another, like an espionage courier who can't remember where the rendezvous is supposed to take place. Herb never returned to Mamma's bed. He went on sleeping on his rollaway in the kitchen leg, which became his reading room as well. How chaste a cot it was, I do not know. If he occasionally closed his after-work book and crept down the hall to the bedroom, it was for nothing more than a brief conjugal visit. In the mornings he was always asleep in his retreat, like a monk in a cell. I don't know why I called him by his first name. Perhaps because Daddy has 2 syllables, while Herb is a 1-syllable sound that falls easily off the childish tongue. A more interesting question is why no one corrected me. Mamma was not one to care about such niceties, but Granny was a stickler for Southern good manners, and Herb himself held such typically British views on children that he would not even let me refer to Mamma and Granny by pronoun. "She is for she-goats," he would snap, yet never made me call him Daddy. I think their permissiveness sprang from an unconscious wish on all their parts to regard our family group as 3 siblings with Granny at the matriarchal helm. Mamma wanted a buddy instead of a husband, Herb wanted an intellectual companion instead of a wife, and Granny wanted to boss a show, any show. By never saying Daddy, I symbolically eliminated the patriarchal figure that would have spoiled their game. My unfilial custom caused consternation on Park Road. "Is he your real father?" a lady asked me. "Yes, ma'am, but I call him by his first name." She shook her head in disapproval, but she did not seem very surprised. A man who wears a tuxedo while emptying the garbage at 4 a.m. is bound to have strange children. His sartorial habits led to a number of puzzled inquiries. The most memorable incident occurred one night when he stopped by the corner drugstore on his way to work and ran into old Mrs. McIntyre, the neighborhood nosy Parker. "I've been meaning to ask you something," she squawked in her going deaf voice. "Are you an undertaker?" "No, madam, but I'll be happy to call one for you." She didn't hear it, but everyone else in the store did. Now, when he went out in the daytime, he usually took me with him. We walked up to the Mount Pleasant branch library, I holding his index finger, and he talking, patiently explaining what things were and how they worked, streetcars, fire hydrants, the yellow line down the middle of the street. When we entered the library, the stern-faced, spinsterish librarians would look up with smiles and carol, "Oh, here's Mr. King," in a way that made me realize that women liked Herb the way men liked Mamma. While he chose his books, I had to sit absolutely still and recite to myself the things he had taught me, the alphabet, the presidents, and the 5 degrees of peerage, Duke, Marquess, Earl, Viscount, and Baron. When he had his books, he would take me upstairs to the children's room and help me pick out something for myself. Afterwards, we sat in the park outside the library, ostensibly for me to play, but really because he could not wait to get at his books. He would open them and do some preliminary scanning, and I, never much for playing, would do the same with mine. One afternoon he uttered a triumphant aha. "What?" I said. He tapped the page. "Occam's razor. It's the law of intellectual thrift devised by William of Ockham, a medieval philosopher." He read aloud. "He said that hypotheses should never be developed beyond necessity." "What's that mean?" When your grandmother joined the daughters, she produced proof of 23 qualified ancestors, but she only needed one. Oh, I get it. On our way back home, we stopped by the arcade market on 14th Street and had a snack. I had coffee, which usually involved a struggle with the disapproving countergirl, and Herb, who had a sweet tooth, chose a sundae. A popular concoction at this time was something called an Ethiopian Delight, green pistachio ice cream for Mussolini, chocolate syrup for Haile Selassie, and a cherry for the League of Nations. It was the kind of cue Herb always took advantage of. When we got home, he pointed out Ethiopia on the map and showed me pictures of Mussolini and Haile Selassie in life. He taught me how to print my name and devised a way to teach me how to write in script. In the early hours of the morning after he got home from work, he sat at the kitchen table laboriously dotting out my name over and over in a drugstore tablet. I spent the next several days tracing the dots until I was able to sign myself with a fairly respectable flourish. All went well until he tested my ear with the idea of giving me music lessons. "Sing this," he said, playing a note. I complied. "And now this," he said, playing another one. "Well, they're the same," I protested. "She's right," said Mama. "I'm a witness. Sounded like the same goddamn toot to me." He gave us a long, studious look, nodded in resignation, and put his clarinet away. Our apartment gave every evidence of having been decorated by Jekyll and Hyde. Herb's alcove, as it was known, was a motto of Spartan order, while Mama's bedroom looked at all times as if the Gestapo had just searched it. Granny saw nothing unladylike about this, and in fact encouraged slovenliness as a mark of aristocracy. She looked down on good housekeepers, dismissing them as scrubbers. A scrubber, I learned early on, is a northern woman who substitutes good housekeeping for good blood. Knowing that she can never be a lady, she develops a bee in her bonnet, that is, unfeminine insanity, about being able to eat off the floor. It was virtually impossible to eat off our table, hidden as it was under skeins of crochet yarn and clippings from the sports page that Mama was saving for her baseball scrapbook. Slut's wool, like gone to see dandelions, lay undisturbed under our furniture. Dishes were piled up to the spigot in the sink. The refrigerator handle stuck to our hands. Little pieces of singed food clung to the stove burners, and the oven door had a permanent gummy border of gravy and long rivulets of greasy scum. In Reflections in a Golden Eye, describing the stove of the captain's wife, who was half Yankee, Carson McCullers wrote, "Their gas stove was not crusted with generations of dirt as her grandmother's had been, but then it was by no means clean." Ours was a pure-blooded stove. Jency still came once a week, but except for washing the dishes, she did little to alleviate the mess. She and Granny spent most of the day sitting at the cluttered table, drinking coffee and talking about how wonderful the world would be if only they could run it. When they finished their encyclicals, they polished the silver. Their silver ritual was supposed to teach me the ladylike art of taking care of my things. Silver is the Southern woman's proudest possession and highest priority, as well as the subject of much of her conversation. The night before her daughter's wedding, a Southern mother will sit on the bed and talk intimately about silver. Every decent woman goes to her husband with 12 covers, and if the knives have hollow handles, he'll be running with other women before the year is out. You just wait and see. No man respects a woman with hollow handles. A marriage can fall apart if a bride does not choose her silver pattern carefully. A good pattern is known as, "They've been making that one forever." A bad pattern is known as, "They don't make silver the way they used to." Bad patterns are the stark modern designs that are easy to keep clean. A good pattern is as busy as a Grecian frieze, and manifests what sober company brochures call the elegant and highly prized glow of deep patina. That is, those black lines made by ground in dirt that you can't get at no matter how many gauze-wrapped toothpicks you use. My first household chore was wrapping gauze around toothpicks so Granny and Jency could sit in the midst of wall-to-wall patina and polish silver. They polished it while it was still shining from their last polishing. They polished it while a mouse gnawed happily through a soggy bag of garbage. They polished it while a flapping window shade gave off a dust storm under their noses. Our silver was the only thing in our house that was ever really clean, which is a sure sign of a Southern home. Granny's pattern was the goodest of the good, as furrowed as a damaged brain, and so full of acorns and rosebuds that our palms ached after every meal. Thanks to its intricacies, it frequently served as a salvaging conversation piece for appalled visitors who were trying not to look at the filth, like Mr. Van Vries, the insurance man who is from Poughkeepsie. Granny always offered him coffee and asked for news of his ailing mother. "Oh, she's having trouble with her knees," he said. "They're so sore and swollen she can't stand up." "Oh, what a shame," Granny commiserated. "Whatever caused it?" "I don't really know. The doctor can't say." "This is beautiful silver. What's it called?" "Williamsburg carbuncle," said Herb. Something that actually did run in our family was agnosticism. Herb believed in reincarnation. Mama preferred unorthodox home truths like, "When you're dead, you're dead." And Granny's theology had been enervated by her superiority complex. A lifetime of looking down on the Bible Belt South, as only a Virginian can, had driven her into a bizarre form of heresy. Christianity reminded her of places like Georgia. As usual, there was an etiquette factor in her thinking. She objected strenuously to the Baptist habit of referring to Jesus as though he lived down the road, and always carefully said, "Our Lord Jesus Christ." Yet her views on his place in the heavenly pecking order were bleak. "Girls in occupied countries always get in trouble with soldiers," she said, when I asked her what the virgin birth was. She did, however, believe in heaven because it was a ladylike place with pink clouds, harp music, and a man to open the door. But most of all, she believed in that Chivas Regal of Protestantism, the Episcopal Church. About every 6 weeks or so, she became spiritually gravid, awakening on Sunday morning with a smug smile that told us she was in the mood to lord it with the Lord. "I think it would be nice if we went to church today," she said modestly. "I hate hats," Mama yelled. Granny always argued her down and plunked one of her own Empress Eugenia numbers on Mama's unwilling head. I donned a sickeningly sweet bonnet with long velvet ribbons bought expressly for these redemptive excursions. We alternated between Grace Church in Georgetown, where I was eventually christened, and St. George's in Arlington. Granny led the way up the aisle, trailing fascinators and Jerkis dusting powder. After making sure she had everyone's attention, she went into a full genuflection and made the sign of the cross over her jutting bosom, eyes closed in perfect devotion. When the spirit had passed, she signaled Mama and Herb with a flap of her elbows, and they stepped forward and hauled her to her feet. The service was no sooner underway before she went to sleep. Whenever she slumped in one direction, Mama or Herb would give her a shoulder nudge to send her the other way. I kept hoping she would start snoring while I had plenty of witnesses, but she had to be on her back to do her best. Upright, all she produced was a rhythmic pock that punctuated our whispers. "The third soprano from the right is flat. I'm going to be flat on the floor if I don't have a cigarette." Lighten our darkness, we beseech thee, O Lord, and by thy great mercy defend us from all perils and dangers of the night. "What's a smite?" I asked. After church, we always drove over to Congressional Cemetery to visit the family plot. It contained 2 graves. One belonged to my grandfather, whose stern gray slab of it contained a Masonic emblem and the dates 1868, 1921. The other stone was a tiny white one, topped by a reclining lamb, and inscribed with the wistful dates 1905, 1910. It belonged to Mama's brother Charlie, who had died of polio when she was a baby. I loved the lamb and always patted it. "Why did he have to die, Granny?" I asked one Sunday. She shifted on the stone bench and sighed. "It was July and so hot, the hottest day I ever saw. He went off to play, and when he came home he turned the hose on himself. I always thought that was what did it. President Roosevelt went swimming on a hot day. He took sick that night. The doctor came, but there was nothing he could do. The paralysis took his legs and rose up. When it reached his lungs, he was gone." She stared for a moment at the wedding ring that was now embedded in the flesh of her finger. "The undertaker couldn't come right away. Boston was real country then, and he was off somewhere on another call, so we had to have ice. Everybody in town brought us theirs, and Mr. Rudding and I took turns sitting beside Charlie and keeping the ice on him." She shook her head slowly. "It's the strangest disease. Your mother was a baby in her crib, lying right there in the next room, but she didn't catch it. I wonder if they'll ever figure out what causes it." Looking up, I saw Mama watching Granny with an expression of mute pleading. Suddenly, in some instinctive way, I understood something. Charlie had been Granny's favorite child. Mama was too young to remember him, but his ghost must have shaped her life, urging her to become a tomboy to replace the son Granny had lost. I think Herb must have understood it, too, the way he always understood everything about people. It explained why he was the only member of the family who never tried to tone Mama down. He seemed to know that she had to act out her conflicts, and in her own brusque way she was grateful to him. On most Sundays, we visited family in Virginia. Our people, Granny always called them, disliking the word family for its bourgeois implications. Anyone could have a family. She wanted a race all to herself, a breed apart, a private gene pool in which to dunk herself with ponderous grace, the way she did at Colonial Beach in her skirted bathing costume. It boiled down to paying a long-day call on Aunt Nana and sitting in her dim parlor talking about whose mind was going and who was passing clots. Granny and Aunt Nana did all the talking, with Granny eventually dominating the conversation for reasons that were clear to me even at 4, however much Aunt Nana might wish otherwise. The fact remained that very few women lost their minds, while all women menstruated, all women had the menopause, and most women gave birth. Long after Aunt Nana had run out of hand-wringing maniacs, Granny still had a full storehouse of pelvic disarray to relate. Herb called her Sunday monologues the Ovariad. He always retreated to the kitchen to play chess with Billy Bosworth, Evelyn Cunningham's husband. They were not friends. Herb had no male friends, but there was a certain bond between them. Herb had given Evelyn away, so to speak, when he handed her over to Billy in front of the National Geographic Society on the night of the lecture, so Billy regarded him as a kind of father-in-law. Evelyn, of course, could not get enough of the Ovariad. She sat at Granny's feet, and I sat in a corner chair reading my library book, while the sanguine saga gushed and flowed around me. It just went splat, and there she was, wearing a white dress. She found a lump as big as a golf ball in it. She thought it might be a cancer, so she called the doctor, and he told her to bring it over in a jar and let him look at it. But she was so upset, she left the jar on the streetcar and had to go down to the car barn and fill out a lost and found form before she could get it back. By that time, it was all dried up. Oh, shit. Louise, the child can hear you. Granny worried constantly that I would be corrupted by Mama's cussing, but she did not care how much of the Ovariad I heard. To her way of thinking, It was part of my training in Southern ladyhood. Thus, by the age of 4, I was conversant with wombs, tubes, polyps, cauterized cervixes, curettage, floods, flows, splats, and the change of life. Menstruation was such a commonplace topic that I could not understand why drugstores modestly wrapped Kotex in brown paper before placing them on the shelves. If the druggists could have heard what I heard in Aunt Nana's parlor, they would have sold them with full-color photographs of blood-soaked napkins on the front of the box. Granny continued her ovariad at the movies whenever the plot gave her the slightest encouragement. She had pay dirt the day we went to see the Technicolor Fox Hunt extravaganza, Virginia, starring Madeleine Carroll and Sterling Hayden. It began with carefree scenes of riding to hounds, but to Granny's delight, the healthful outdoor exercise soon stopped. Madeleine fainted on the field and took to her chaise lounge, where, fetchingly attired in a black riding habit that emphasized her pallor, she sipped delicately at a medicinal glass of port. Madeleine actually had TB, but Granny was not interested in any organ as high up as lungs. She immediately jumped to conclusions. "Wine makes blood," she whispered to me. "She had a miscarriage, only they can't come right out and say it. She had no business bouncing up and down on that old horse. That's bad for a woman's parts." Soon Madeleine weakened so much that she had to go away to a sanatorium. Before she left, she promised to come back to Virginia, and she did. She returned in a coffin that was deposited at the train station, and Sterling Hayden had to sign for it. He knew she was too weak to carry a child. He should have been more considerate. The doctor should have told him not to bother her. It was the first of her comments that I did not understand. As voluble as she was about how babies, either whole or liquefied, came out, she was remarkably taciturn about how they got in. She divided sex into 2 categories, the unmentionable kind involving men and copulation, and the fun kind. "Granny," I said as we walked home from the show, "how did Sterling Hayden bother Madeleine Carroll to death?" "Never mind. But I want to know. You're too young. Granny, please tell me." "Oh, all right," she said irritably. I waited breathlessly for the revelation. "Your grandfather was a perfect gentleman." Going to the movies with Mama exposed me to an entirely different kind of running commentary. They died with their boots on. "I wish he'd stop kissing her and lead a cavalry charge." The women. "What this needs is George Raft." Anna Karenina. "Oh boy, here comes the train." Back street. "That woman ought to have her head examined." Madam X. "She's wasting the taxpayers' money." King's Row. "How the hell is he going to do her any good? He can't even turn over without help." Many years later, when my insular life opened up and I met people whose second language was Yiddish, I learned that Mama was what is known as a klutz. There is a comparable Southern word, but never having seen it in print, I am not sure of the spelling. It is either slewfoot or slewfoot, S-L-E-W or S-L-U-E. The first is a variant of slow or slog and suggests someone tramping through mud holes or swamps in heavy boots. The second is a nautical word of unknown origin that refers to the violent swing of a ship's spar, or any lurching, veering movement. However it's spelled, it's a word I grew up hearing. It invariably cropped up whenever Southerners discussed Eleanor Roosevelt, but to me it was my mother's nickname. Granny brought it out on a long sigh whenever Mama did some domestic thing badly or started a fire with her cigarette, and my uncle, undoubtedly to get even for a Godapot, called her Slewfoot Lou. That slew-footedness affected her mothering is like saying that hemophilia affected the course of the Romanov dynasty. Today I admire her lack of vocation for motherhood, but at 4 I was convinced that she was trying to murder me. 2 things happened, one on top of the other, that made me draw this disturbing conclusion. The first involved the sudden disappearance of most of my teeth. It was, as Snoopy would say, a dark and stormy night. Herb was at work, and Granny was in Richmond visiting her sister, which meant that Mama was playing without an infield. It also meant that she was in charge of the cooking, so we walked up to the Chinese restaurant on 14th Street to get some carryout. "I'm cold," I said as we headed back home. "Walk under my coat," Mama offered. It worked fine until we came to the corner of 13th and Park Road. I can still see the curbstone looming up in front of me as I write this, just as it loomed up that night when I tripped and fell and hit my mouth on it. There was a shattering pain and the terrifying purplish color of my blood and the dirty yellow glow of the street lamps. It was not the kind of crisis that brought out Mama's strength. She would have been great on the Titanic or in an air raid. At Little Bighorn or Thermopylae, she would have stolen the show from Custer and Leonidas. But at 13th and Park Road, she fell apart. Moaning, "Oh, Jesus Christ, oh shit," she slung me over her shoulder like a sack of meal and ran the rest of the way home. In the kitchen, when she got a good look at me, an expression of helpless terror spread over her face. All of my front teeth were knocked out, except one that hung by the thread of flesh, and the inside of my bottom lip felt like the surface of a cheese grater. I was screaming in pain and fear, and there was blood everywhere, even on my shoes. Mama's solution was salt. Grabbing the blue box of Morton's from the stove, she opened the spout, yanked my head back by my hair, and poured the stuff directly into my mouth. Naturally, some of it went up my nose and into my eyes. I won't even try to describe the agony. "It'll sterilize you," Mama yelled over my shrieks. "It's so you don't get lockjaw. Salt's the purest thing there is. That's why they say the salt of the earth." I struck at her and pulled away and ran down the hall to the bathroom, where I tried futilely to reach the cold water faucet on the basin. Mama turned on the water and lifted me up, and I cupped my hands and splashed water in my mouth and eyes. I rinsed and spat until the pain receded and the bleeding stopped. The loose tooth came out and went down the drain. When we were both calmed down, Mama fixed me an ice bag, after dropping one tray of cubes on the floor, and put me into her bed, where I lay whimpering until Herb came home at 2 a.m. "Did you take her to the dentist?" he asked, after hearing the story. Mama exploded. "If she doesn't have any goddamn teeth, why does she need a goddamn dentist?" He considered this in his imperturbable way. I suppose it did have a certain awful logic, and then suggested aspirin. He fetched the bottle from the medicine chest, and Mama began crushing tablets in a cup. They were a draught strength, and she used 4 or 5, but when Herb objected to the massive dose, she replied, "Just for good measure." She dissolved the crushed aspirin in warm water, and I managed to swallow it. "Atta girl," she said approvingly. "You'll be all right now. That's enough aspirin to kill a horse." That made me burst into renewed sobs. "I want Granny." Mama's mouth tightened and she looked away, but I was too young and too sick to realize that I had hurt her, or to care. After all, wasn't she trying to kill me? That her saline solution to the crisis was a direct outgrowth of Granny's dictum that whiskey or salt will cure anything also eluded me. All I knew was that my mother had done to me what brutal sea captains did to flogging victims in sailing ship movies, poured salt on open wounds. The next day, they called Granny in Richmond, and she hurried home. When the question of taking me to a dentist arose, she said, "Dentists don't know anything," and then took me to one. It was always the same. She would consult professionals if she had to, but first she had to run them down. "Doctors don't know anything, lawyers don't know anything, CPAs don't know anything," were household chants in the dual service of her ego and her anti-intellectualism. The dentist performed a mopping-up operation, and Granny fed me thick cream and raw oysters until my mouth healed. Not having any teeth was a source of embarrassment to me, but Mama supplied me with a comeback for the curious. "Tell 'em he got in a fight, and if they think you look funny, they ought to see the other girl." "Oh, Louise!" A few months later, the hand that rocks the cradle struck again, It happened at my uncle's house, when Mama decided to teach me how to bat. "You chop at the ball the way girls do," she said scornfully. "You're supposed to put your whole body into it. Pull it all the way around in a follow-through swing like this. See how I saw stars," and crumpled to the ground. Somewhere amid the buzzing and shrilling sounds in my head, I heard a voice cry out, "Oh, Louise, you've killed the child." I came to in Aunt Charlotte's bed, with an ice bag over my fast-swelling lump. Mamma stood at the foot of the bed, trying manfully to conceal her terror. She held a cigarette lighter. As my eyes opened, she flicked it on and moved it back and forth in front of my face. "She's not blind," she yelled. "See, her eyes are following it." Flicking the lighter off, she moved swiftly to the head of the bed and bent over me. "Boo!" she bellowed in my ear. I jumped and started crying. "See, she's not deaf." "She might go crazy," Aunt Nana said in a voice full of hope. "Being hit in the head like that, you never can tell what it might do to her mind." Mama had a test for this, too. "What's 2 and 2?" she fired at me. "4," I whimpered. "See, if she was crazy, she'd say 5. Which weighs more, a pound of lead or a pound of feathers?" "Christ's sake, Louise," Uncle Botetourt grumbled. "Leave the poor kid alone. You've done enough for one day." "Shut your goddamn mouth! Don't go giving me any orders, you turd-faced son of a—" "Both of you shut up," Aunt Charlotte snapped. "She's got a bad enough headache as it is." They shut up, and everyone stood around the bed staring at me. It was like a Russian novel. For the next several weeks I was closely observed for dizzy spells and speech problems, but I never developed either one or any other physical impairments. Whether or not I went crazy is impossible to say. A maniac could hide in my family as a leaf can hide in the forest. I merely harbored the certainty that Mama was trying to rub me out because I was not a boy. I knew she had wanted a boy. She was always careful never to say so outright, but her whole stance proclaimed it from the rooftops. I derived no comfort from the knowledge that Granny had wanted me to be a girl, and that Herb was a woman's man who disliked male companionship. Of the adults in my life, I loved Granny best, and enjoyed Herb's company the most. But these were secondary priorities, formed in my conscious mind, and based on logical choices. I was concerned with that vital primitive theory. To a small child, especially a female one, it's the mother who counts, even if she comes in third in a race of 3. The conviction that I was marked for infanticide remained with me until the 2nd grade, when Mama proved her love for me with 2 heroic acts, one of them positively hair-raising. That ends Chapter 3, and thank you for listening to it.